Screencast chapters 6, 7, and 8, part 4. We last left off with relief. And a relief print is any printing method which the image to be printed is raised from the background. So a lot like a rubber stamp. You know, if your teacher has ever stamped a star on your paper, that would be that like rubber stamp. It's raised. So that's the part that will be inked. The most common material for this type of print would be wood. Now this is what we would traditionally look at as a wood cut. You can see here it's very bold, very graphic, blacks and whites, very stark. A wood cut is the oldest printmaking technique. What the artist does first is they draw the image on a piece of wood, then all the areas that are meant to be printed are cut away. So, or all the areas that are not meant to be printed are cut away. So where the drawing is at, that's left, so that's the raised portion. The ink is then put onto the block, usually with a roller, and then the only area that is holding the ink is that raised area. So then the block is pressed on paper. This is the Chinese Diamond Sutra, which you will find on page 179, figure 8.2 in your text. Now, one of the things that you have to remember about woodcut is that when we're doing printmaking techniques, everything is done backwards. So the artist has to do it backwards so that it prints correctly. So think about things that were done with lettering and writing on it. Everything had to have been done backwards. So pretty amazing. This will be your example of a woodcut that will be on the exam. This is Albrecht Dürer and the Four Horsemen in the Apocalypse. Now, color printmaking is done where the artist must cut one block for each color. So each color has to be printed separately. So here you can see the far image on the right is the complete piece, but where we start out is we have a yellow block, a chartreuse or green block, blue block, a red block, a black block, and then that final block they did some gold leafing on the top. Now, that plate or block that is actually printed with the ink on it is actually called a master plate. Now, the process of aligning the colors and aligning these blocks together is called a registration, and that registration mark looks like the sight on a gun. Those are normally found up in the corners, and they would line those up to where we know that everything would line up perfectly. There wouldn't be any ghosting. When I was a kid, they did a lot more printing where there was ghosting, catalogs, things like that. The only place today that I think that you guys would possibly see some of this stuff is on your cereal boxes. When you open those tabs, you'll see little color blocks that'll show you the inks that were used, and sometimes you can find this registration mark on those also. Now, a linocut, it is very similar to a woodcut. It looks the same as a woodcut. And the major difference is the material is softer. So it's actually easier for the artist to work with, but because it is easier to work with and easier to carve, that also means that it is softer, which means it's less durable and it will only make a smaller edition number of prints. So we can't get as many prints out of a linocut versus a woodcut. Page 183, figure 8.6 in your text is an example of a linocut. This will be the linocut that you will see on your exam. This is the Pablo Picasso. Note that down there in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see his name kind of vaguely. And also here you can see the registration didn't line up completely. You see the blues coming outside of the lines, the reds coming outside of the lines, so that registration is a little off in this piece. Now, this is an example of a wood engraving. And a wood engraving is done on the end grain of the wood. So let's say we have a long board. It's the edge portion that we're using to actually cut out and create this piece. One of the things that you need to note about a wood engraving is it is considered to be a white line technique. What does that mean? It means that we're used to the idea of the paper being white and the ink being black. Think of it in reverse. Think of the paper as being black and the ink being white. That's that white line technique. This Rockwell Kent piece will be the example that you will see on your exam for a wood engraving. Now, intaglio or intaglio. These are areas that are meant to be printed are below the surface of the printing plate. So that actual top portion, like in the relief, that's not the part that will be having the ink. It will be below. Ink sinks into the depressions, and then the paper is basically soaked in water to where it's softer, and then the paper is pushed into those depressions so that it picks up the image. There are 5 basic types of intaglio or intaglio printing. Page 184, figure 8-7. Again, you'll see some illustrations of those, might help you understand it a little bit better. We have engraving, dry point, mezzotint, etching, and aquatint. So engraving. In engraving, it is the oldest of the intaglio techniques. Is developed from medieval practice of incising designs into armor. And this particular tool that you see here on your left is called a burin tool. It's the basic tool for engraving. That is sharp. It's V-shaped, so you can see that V or diamond shaped there. And it's used to cut lines into the metal plate. Now, dry point is similar to engraving, but the tool is a dry point needle. The artist draws on the plate as if it were paper, so you just draw like normal. The needle raises what is called a burr, or a thin ridge of metal, and that burr is what actually holds the ink. So here is what a dry point needle looks like. So you can see you can just draw directly on the plate. Now, a mezzotint, this is a reverse process in which the artist works from dark to light. So how they actually do this is they take and prepare the plate by roughening it with a tool called a rocker. If it were inked at that point, the entire print would be black. So it's raising a burr on the entire plate. Now, lighter tones are created by smoothing out rough spots with what is called a burnisher. So it's kind of almost like a spoon-shaped tool to smooth spots out. The major advantage for a mezzotint is its values. So you need to remember it's a reverse process from working from dark to light, and it's based on values. As of right now, anything that you have seen that's a value change, it's basically value change because of, let's say, the building up of shapes, sort of like a cross-hatching kind of technique. But with this, it's more like that rendering. So here we see on the left-hand side the rocker tool. That's what they would use to rock back and forth across the whole metal plate. And then on the right-hand side, you see what's called a burnishing tool. That's where they would go back in and kind of spoon and smooth things out. On that video link, you'll see some examples of how these tools are used. This is an example of the mezzotint that you will see on your exam. So here you can see there are a huge difference in the value changes that are happening. Now, etching. This is done with acids, which eat lines and depressions into the metal plate. So what happens is first the plate must be coated with an acid-resistant substance called a ground, oftentimes a beeswax. Okay, next you draw on the plate with an etching needle, so that like dry point etching needle, and it removes the ground. So you're just scratching away that beeswax and it exposes that bare metal. Then what they'll do is they'll take that plate and they will dip it into an acid bath. So only the portions of the plate that have been exposed are then eaten by the acid, eating away at those depressions. So this Rembrandt will be the example that you will see on your exam. Now, an aquatint. This is a way of achieving flat areas of tone, gray values basically. The plate is first dusted with a resin and then heated so that the resin sticks. So I think of it as taking like a handful of baby powder and sprinkling it on the surface. Then they would take and heat it to where it would kind of melt and stick to the surface. Then what they're doing is they're taking it and dipping it in that acid bath to where the acid eats away wherever the resin was not at. Now, this does not print lines. It only prints areas of tone. So think of backgrounds, moods, those kinds of things that you're going to get from this. It is always combined with another technique. Aqua tint is always combined with another technique. This will be the example of the aqua tint that you will have on your exam, the Mary Cassette. Interesting thing to note, Mary Cassette, they have some original Mary Cassettes up at the Mitchell Museum in Mount Vernon if you're ever interested in taking a look at that. Now, lithography. This was invented by Alois Sinfelder. It's what is called a planographic process. Now, this is the printmaking surface is flat, and that the drawing is put onto a stone surface, that's the block, with a grease crayon. It basically works off of the idea that oil and water don't mix. This Toulouse-Lautrec will be the example of the lithograph that you will see on your exam. And these were done posters for the Moulin Rouge. Now, screen printing. This is where the image is transferred to paper by forcing ink through a fine mesh which has areas that are not meant to be printed that have been blocked out, or what we would think of as a stenciling technique. Okay, this is oftentimes called a serigraph or a silk screen. So those of you who have t-shirts that have things printed on them, that's that silk screen technique, okay? But when we think of it as a fine art, we're generally calling it a serigraph. Now, special techniques. If you remember in the beginning of the printmaking section, I said that printmaking was the art of multiples. Here's the one exception to that rule. Okay, it is called a monoprint or a monotype. If you can remember that mono means one, you're only going to get one out of this. Okay, so that the original is destroyed and cannot be duplicated again. So what they do is they actually take a surface, a plate of some kind, paint with those inks directly onto that surface just like a painter would. Then they apply the paper, transfer the image to, but once that image is transferred to that piece of paper, it's lost on the plate. You can't just re-ink it. It would have to be a totally new print that is created. Now, inkjet printing. According to traditional definition, a print is made from what is called a matrix. For a woodcut, the matrix would be the wood. Now, in the inkjet printer, it is a more sophisticated version of a home printer. And a high-quality printer creates an image from a digital file by spraying mists of ink at a surface, such as a piece of paper. So there's no matrix. That is the end of this section.